Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. James E. Mitchell and John Bruce Jessen, the two psychologists responsible for designing many of the torture tactics used against prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, will for the first time give answers. The two are expected to give testimony at a pretrial hearing on the 9/11 attacks before a military tribunal in Guantanamo Bay this week. Many activists hope this will cast light on the torture program used. On today's show, we not only take a closer look at the story, but we discuss and look back at the 18-year history of the detention camp and how it introduced a new era of torture tactics. Joining us for this session is Mr. Dan Aalbers, who's an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Alaska Southeast. He joins us from Alaska. Also joining us today is Mr. David Remes, who is a lawyer in Washington, D.C., and who has represented more than 24 Guantanamo detainees. He joins us also from Washington, D.C. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Remes, let me begin with you. Now, how significant do you see this hearing of these two psychologists who are responsible for designing this torture program?
It's incredibly significant. For the first time, they're going to be put under oath and grilled by defense lawyers in the military commissions about how they started their program and all of the details. The goal in that case is to prevent the men who are on trial there from getting the death penalty by showing that the United States is in no moral position to execute them.
Right. Now, before this, when you're talking details being given about the torture tactics used, before this hearing specifically, how difficult was it to get details, even as a lawyer who has represented a number of detainees?
Well, in fact, it was incredibly difficult. Most of this was kept top secret for years. It was only in the last several years that the Senate Intelligence Committee in the United States Congress was able to produce much of the information about the torture program over the vigorous opposition of the CIA.
Right. Now, Mr. I understand that you just recently visited the prison, visited some of your clients there, some who were tortured in a black site, what is known as a dark prison. Knowing that you can't get into the details of this case, what is this dark prison?
The dark prison is a prison near Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan, where prisoners were brought to be tortured. It wasn't the regular U.S. military prisons. This was a special one for some detainees who were deemed to have especially important or secret knowledge that the government thought might be able to stave off attacks or provide information about individuals that it was seeking worldwide in the war on terror.
Right. So the masses of using systematic torture is something that many people have speculated, many people have also known. But this time around, with getting these words on record, people will actually be able to know what has been happening inside the detention camp and in offsites.
From the horse's mouth, as it were. These particular individuals who were tortured by Mitchell and Jensen received the worst. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, as everyone knows, was waterboarded 183 times, leading one of our senators to say, well, if torture is so effective, why did he have to be waterboarded 183 times? But that's beside the point. They were put in cramped boxes and kept there in the dark. They were covered with insects, where the government felt that this was their greatest fear. They were held upside down. My client, Hassan bin Attash, who happens to be the brother of one of the 9/11 defendants, was only a kid when he was captured. He was held upside down with his feet off the ground with chains. He was exposed to blinding strobe lights, Klieg lights, we would call them, acting as strobe lights, shining close in his face while terrible music was blaring. In fact, it was terrible sort of as a secondary point. Every effort was made to break him down. He lost hearing in an ear. He can't see out of one eye. I have another detainee client, Abdul Salam al-Hila, who was kept in a room in total darkness, chained to the wall in a manner that prevented him from sleep. Both of them were subject to sleep deprivation. When I first met them in 2005, 2004, I was shocked because these techniques were everything we had read about. It was horrifying.
Right. I just want to jump to Mr. Dan Aalbers and talk to him about this. You are hearing whatever David Remes is talking about, the tactics that were used. What are the long-term implications, mental implications of using such tactics on a person?
I mean, most people report having nightmares for years afterwards. People have an ability to trust others. They go back to the experience time and time again with memories they can't ever seem to shake. And these people are going to be debilitated for the rest of their life. Because we know that post-traumatic stress disorder, which it seems that most of these people are suffering from according to an independent analysis of the people who have been released from Guantanamo Bay, is a lifelong condition. And unfortunately, we know that the people at Guantanamo now are not being treated as torture victims. There is a lack of good mental health care happening at Guantanamo Bay, and we need to get torture experts in torture rehabilitation in there to help these people.
Right. That, of course, one of the things that must be done, and we're going to talk in detail about what else needs to be done in order to give these people a fair trial, a fair chance of being able to prove their guilt or prove their innocence. But before that, Mr. Aalbers, also talking about the link of psychology and to the designing of detention centers. Now, what is the link there? Many people don't really understand when we're talking about these two psychologists giving their feedback on the work they've done in this detention center. What is really the link?
I mean, the link is that these two psychologists reinvented, they reconstructed a system of torture that psychologists had already helped to construct in the 1950s and 60s. So when the United States was fighting the Cold War, it decided it was going to reverse engineer the Soviet program. And the Soviets had found that one of the worst things you can do to a human being is simply lock them in a room by themselves for 6 weeks without any meaningful human contact. And within 6 weeks, you would reduce them to an animal-like state where they no longer were able to take care of themselves.
Right.
Humans are social animals, and we need these. So out of this reverse engineering, we found that if you simply isolate somebody, if you use the sort of techniques that Mr. Remes has talked about so well, of sensory bombardment, of extreme levels of deprivation, you can break someone down very, very effectively. And when Mitchell and Jessen went to the CIA and said, we want to be a part of this program, they presented themselves as experts in this sort of psychology. And they also said that because we're also healers, because we have this ability to really change what we're doing in the moment, we are the best possible people to put in there. Because not only do we have the background and theory that the CIA already knew. The CIA already knew how to do all these things. But Mitchell and Jessen said that because we are not just scientists, but we're also healers, we can actually apply this better than anybody else.
Right. Mr. David Remes, now just trying to move couple of steps back and linking what Mr. Aalbers talked about, reducing a person to almost an animal-like state. One wonders, what is the point of all this torture if torture taints evidence that can be used within court or within trying someone further on, but still using that systematically? What is the point of this detention center and torturing so many detainees?
The original purpose, as I say, was this horribly misguided thought that if you tortured people, and this was in the aftermath of 9/11 with all of the hysteria and fear in the United States, that if you tortured these people, you would somehow get useful information to use to help fight terrorism. It was done with a complete disregard of all of the science, as I'm sure Mr. Aalbers would confirm. And yet the attitude was, as Vice President Cheney said, the gloves are coming off. We're going to the dark side. And I would add that the torture, again, with respect to what Mr. Aalbers said, was so extreme that one of the detainees, if the interrogator simply raised an eyebrow, would jump on a table at the interrogator's request. As I say, no useful information was produced by all of this torture. And in any event, the torture is immoral, inhumane, and violates international and American law. It was a terribly dark chapter in the United States. I'm glad it's behind us. I hope it will be behind us forever.
But when you say that it is behind us, there are still 40 detainees within this detention center. What is their future like? What does it seem like will happen with them in the future? We don't see any signs of this place closing down.
Let me start by saying that it was only after lawyers were allowed into the detention center back in 2004 that the physical abuse of the detainees began to modify. And I'd say in the last several years, they are just sitting in empty cell blocks in despair, gloom, and a state of hopelessness for some of them. The United States has no intention of letting some of them out. And under the Trump administration, it's almost certain that no detainees will be let out. These are detainees who an administrative review board will refuse to clear, even though they've been not been accused of any crime and they've not done anything wrong. They're basically trapped, and it is the saddest thing.
Mr. Remes, you all stated here that it is a violation of U.S. law. That's one of the things that comes up as a dispute or something that many people argue against. Is it, in fact, a violation of U.S. law if this is not happening on U.S. territory?
Well, we do have an anti-torture law, and I don't care where it's happening in the world. It's a violation of law. It's a violation of human rights. And ironically enough, the Bush administration thought by putting these men in Guantanamo, it would be escaping the law. Well, ultimately, the law caught up with them. Unfortunately, the only people who have been punished in respect to this program were whistleblowers who brought it to public attention. Again, as I say, where the United States commits torture is irrelevant to whether it violates the law.
Right. Mr. Aalbers, when we're talking about this extreme form of torture, one thing that I did ask you before, but I do want more clarity on it from myself and the viewers. Can individuals who go through such trauma then have a chance of being rehabilitated?
Absolutely. I think that if they are put into supportive communities, they have a chance of living a better and fuller life. I do think that they're likely the men who have been there for so long, and their torture has been so extreme, and they have been years sitting there rotting in this prison without being treated for the effects of the torture. And so I worry quite a bit for their state. Yes, there is something that could be done. I think that what should happen is these men should get into the hands of people like the Center for Victims of Torture that have amazing torture rehabilitators, experts in how to heal this. But I also think I can't give you an entirely optimistic view. I really do think that we have likely done permanent harm to these individuals.
Right. Mr. Remes, we're talking about the chance of permanent harm to these men, and it's not just about the 40 men that reside now here. It's 780 men who pass through this detention center. Can you give us a sense of the charges or the suspicions on which they were picked up, the procedure, the process of bringing them there? What was it like?
It was almost cinematic in its vividness. They were rounded up. Many of them were brought to the United States authorities by bounty hunters in Afghanistan. Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld had leaflets dropped promising bounties of $5,000 a detainee, which is probably more than enough to enrich an Afghan family for generations. I exaggerate a little bit. And, you know, I have to also point out that a lot of these men were fighting on behalf of the Taliban against an internal enemy, the Northern Alliance. Had nothing to do with the U.S., but as soon as the Taliban became the enemy of the U.S., these men became the enemies of the U.S. Enemy combatants. Really, only those who are on trial or facing trial are accused of doing any direct damage to the United States. The rest of them are simply criminals by status, if you will, the status of being on the wrong side of a civil war in another country.
Right. You use that term, enemy combatants, and I wonder what are the legal implications of that term being used by those who are working in this detention center and the people who are labeled as enemy combatants?
Enemy combatants was a term that the Bush administration invented as a way of classifying these men as being beyond the Geneva Conventions and beyond the law, not subject to humane treatment. It was only the United States Supreme Court that said 4 or 5 years after these men were captured that the Geneva Conventions apply to them. But really, it was a term that was used to enable or excuse anything the United States wanted to do to them by putting them in a category beyond the law.
Right. And when you're talking about the Geneva Convention, what are the protections that are explicitly stated there, especially when we talk about prisoners and detainees?
With respect to detainees who have not been charged with anything, the basic protection is called Common Article 3, which applies to anyone regardless of status and requires humane treatment. That's the core of it. They can't be tortured. They have to be able to see their families or communicate with their families, which was denied to them for many, many years. They have to be allowed to exist in communal society, which had also been denied to them for many years. The one thing I'll give the Obama administration credit for in this regard is that when he came into office, the United States began to apply the basic principles of the Geneva Conventions. Nevertheless, the underlying injustice of holding them indefinitely without charging them with any crime is something that I think is unique to the United States, or at least to any democratic system we know in the world.
Right. And you're talking about progress, if that's the right term to use, under the Obama administration. Was that turned back on? Was there a regression of that progress when Trump came into power?
No, it's really been status quo. Please understand, there are only 40 detainees there. 15 of them are called high-value detainees and are segregated from the rest. And they basically live the lives of prisoners in any prison, except I would have to say they probably are in a much different position because there are so few of them in such a large facility. Cell block after cell block has 2 or 3 or 4 men. As I say, it hasn't gotten worse, in my opinion. There hasn't been physical abuse in many, many years. It's the psychological torture now of simply being there and never knowing when they're getting out. That is the basic injustice that is occurring now.
Right. To that basic injustice, Mr. Dan Aalbers, when we talk about this psychological torture, often the gravity of it is not digested fully or is not fully acknowledged compared to the mental torture. But can it have the same implications?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that this is a distinction without a difference. If we are in pain, we feel it mentally. I think that it is the case that many of the people who have been victims of torture tell us that the worst form of torture they experienced was not this momentary pain, but hearing other people being tortured. We are creatures that we tend to mirror what other people are doing and mirror what other people are feeling. And the sympathetic effect has a dramatic effect on individuals. So absolutely. I think that just to make a distinction between physical and mental torture is really a false distinction, because it's what we hold in our mind and the memories that will haunt us for the rest of our lives in many cases.
Right. On that, thank you so much, Mr. Dan Aalbers, for joining us. We're going to go for a short break. When we return, we're going to continue our discussion and see what the future holds for Guantanamo and the prisoners there. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. While we talk about Guantanamo Bay and the prisoners there, what their future looks like and what the future looks like for the detention camp at large. Joining us for this discussion now is Mr. Glenn Carle, who is a career CIA officer and former Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Transnational Threats. He joins us from Boston. Also continuing with us is Mr. David Remes, who's a lawyer in Washington, D.C. and has represented more than 24 Guantanamo detainees. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Thank you both for joining us on the show today. Mr. Carle, now, when we talk about Guantanamo, we've been talking about the torture tactics that were used, the 2 psychologists who will be giving a testimony later this week. But talking about what this detention center represents to the American public at large, what do you think is the symbolic value or significance of it?
Fortunately, there's the larger historical truth of what it represents and means and has done to American society. And then, on the other hand, there's the political reality of how it's defined by our political arguments, and specifically the Republican Party. So historically, in the larger sense, what it actually means is a repudiation or a betrayal of what America is supposed to stand for. In the Spanish in the Spanish-American War and then the Philippine insurgency in 1902, 120 years ago, the United States prosecuted, tried, convicted, and then hanged as war criminals American soldiers for the war crime of waterboarding. We did the same to Japanese intelligence officers and soldiers in World War II. The United States literally wrote the Geneva Conventions, the Uniform Code of Military Justice of the United States, and on I could go. And all of it make very clear that torture is clearly defined and that what happened constitutes torture. Why does Guantanamo still exist? The answer is simple, and it sounds partisan, but it is not, because the Republican Party has blocked all efforts to close it down.
Right. That same point there, Mr. Remes, I want to get your take on it as why does Guantanamo still exist?
Well, in addition to the factor that Mr. Carle just mentioned of Congress prohibiting a president from bringing the detainees even into the United States, I would say that President Trump and those around him have absolutely no interest in releasing any of these men. They will not bring them to the United States for prosecution. They will not accuse them of crimes. This place is going to be there for eternity until the United States faces the fact that what it's done is unjust and these men need to be released. It still regards some of them as enemies of the United States, which is totally absurd. This prison should be shut down and preserved as a memorial to a horrible time in American history.
Right. Now, many of, not many, but you would be able to confirm this for us, Mr. Remes. The prisoners that are amongst the 40 detained at the moment, how many of them are set to be released?
5 of the 40 are set to be released. There are 24 detainees in the category of so-called low-value detainees. There are 15 in the category of high-value detainees. Those include the men who are on trial. Of the 24 so-called low-value detainees, 5 were cleared during the Obama administration. Some were on the verge of being released when he left office, but all 5 now languish, having been approved for transfer because Trump has put an end to releases.
Right. What complications, Mr. Carle, that Mr. Remes is talking about their release, what more is there to keep in mind? Why aren't these people being released even though they have been cleared?
Well, this is it's not only a tragedy in American history and a stain on it, but it rises to the level or descends to the level of lethal farce even. Unfortunately for these people, and I have no brief defending people who, some of whom I think probably deserve to be prosecuted. Nonetheless, in our judicial system, if the law is to mean anything, you cannot try people with evidence that has been obtained illegally under coercion and through torture. So that makes, even under the best circumstance, a trial impossible. And then the Republicans, and I sound partisan, but this is simply objective statement, refuse to coddle, or that's how they would characterize it, the individuals who are detained, and they use this as this whole issue as a tool to beat on the head their political opponents as being weak against terror. When terrorism, and this was my job, I was at the most senior level in the intelligence community assessing threats from terrorism. Where the threat from terrorism has always been, frankly, vastly exaggerated, which is not to say there are not people trying to kill me or other Americans. But this Guantanamo and the detainees have become a bogeyman, which is legally stained, and there's no sensible way out that does not humiliate the United States.
Right. You mentioned here that the threats have been exaggerated. What has been the game plan? What has been the thought process behind the exaggeration of these threats? What is the game there?
Well, a lot of my colleagues and I would say most Americans who fear and are convinced that the threat from terrorism is existential are quite sincere. I'm not challenging the faith of many of my colleagues and compatriots. We're dealing with issues of deep social psychology. And after 9/11 in particular, the CIA had been seized with the threat from terrorism for years. I'd worked on al-Qaeda for years prior to 9/11. There was no surprise there was a failure in stopping a specific attack. But for the American public, this was a new terrifying event. And psychologically, one defines something frightening and misunderstood as the other, and that becomes a bogeyman, like the ghosts in the night. And that's the phenomenon. And then it becomes a political tool to project strength or accuse others of weakness, and the dynamic becomes frozen, and you identify your side, and nothing psychologically changes, except with tremendous slow process of trying to re-educate a psychology of society.
Right. And when you say it becomes a political tool, I would read out Trump's statement in which he stated, "We are going to keep it open. We're going to load it up with some bad dudes." It seems like the intentions here are nowhere near to trying to deal with the situation at hand, deal with the injustice that is happening. That brings us to a central question. What is the future of this detention center? Mr. Remes, what do you think, where do you think the situation is headed?
I'm afraid that there's no end in sight. It gives me no pleasure to say this. Certainly nothing will improve under President Trump. Even if he's replaced by a Democrat, Congress has still tied the president's hands in terms of releases into the United States. And the United States stubbornly insists and defends the detention of these men on the ground that they are somehow a threat to the United States. Even after 18 years of imprisonment, the United States thinks that some of them still have intelligence value, which I think Mr. Carle would readily agree is pretty absurd. But I have to be pessimistic about this. The most that we can do at this point is continue to call attention to the injustice of Guantanamo and try to put pressure on the authorities to close it. But I have to say, given current facts, I'm quite pessimistic that it will be closed for the foreseeable future.
Right. Mr. Keeping in mind whatever Mr. David Remes said. Now, according to a tally by the New York Times, the total cost last year, 2018, was almost $540 million of running this detention center. And that, of course, did not include costs which remained classified. Now, this comes as a huge financial burden as well. Isn't that enough of a reason, enough impetus, if you may, to deal with the situation, for there to be a political will to actually do something about this center?
Something sensible. Of course, financially, that makes no sense. But in defense of, to be fair, costs frequently can legitimately be a secondary consideration when issues of national security are involved. However, that is not the case in this instance. This is a lever to make political points with now, and there are many people, some of whom I admire and honor, who sincerely believe that the threat from Islamic jihadism, we'll call it that for the moment, is an existential threat. But that gets into my point about psychology. So the financial issue, I'm afraid that doesn't hold a lot of weight or have much influence when we're dealing with issues of emotion and political advantage.
Right. Mr. David Remes, now, everything you've has painted a bleak picture for the future, painted a pessimistic future of what is going to happen with this detention center, and yet you are, of course, representing a number of detainees there. How is your work going so far? How has it become more difficult, if at all? Or has there been any relief in trying to pursue their cases?
All that we can do is keep pounding on the table and insisting that the government bring justice into the picture for once. We try to comfort our clients. We try to remain sources of contact with the outside world. We are still fighting in the courts, although those cases usually wind up going against the detainees. And we just keep pushing on because we have no choice. We have to do this. It's a principle of human rights, and we can't just stop. We have to do what we can to help them.
Of course, working towards this, working for a cause, and as you're saying, trying to get the public, general public, the government to reckon with the fact that this is grave injustice is a task that is very difficult to do, especially given the bleak future ahead. Mr. Carle, I want to go back to a point you made earlier, and I feel like it's worthwhile to talk about. You talked about the exaggerated threat of terrorism. How does that impact society, the American society at large, at different levels, not just when we're talking about creating such symbols in which you're showing that you're doing something, even if the implications of them aren't as productive as you made them seem. But how is this threat working at different levels?
Well, thank you for raising that point. This is the reason I have any public existence at all after 20 years clandestinely as a CIA officer, is on this very point, which started from my involvement in the enhanced interrogation program. The consequences are they are existential. I wrote in my book about my involvement in the enhanced interrogation program, which now goes back 19 years, that unseen by the American public, with the American public unaware of what was happening, the enhanced interrogation program has literally changed the culture of the United States. Prior to 9/11, it was inconceivable. I think Mr. Remes will probably nod his head and agree with me. I think all Americans would. Inconceivable that Americans have a supposedly rational discussion about the merits of torture, whether a CIA officer should engage in torture. It was just beyond the pale. Today, polls show that a majority of Americans support the use of torture. The man in the White House, to the extent he understands what he's saying, advocates it. The Republican Party makes this one of its positions when presenting its presidential candidate. If you poll Americans over 50, a strong majority of Americans say torture is un-American, illegal, and should never happen, and that institutions like the CIA exist to oppose it. When you poll Americans under 25, a strong majority of them say, well, you know, guys like Carle, they have to do what they have to do. Torture is okay in certain circumstances. So it has changed us culturally. And on top of that, it has undermined the principle of law and our Constitution. I found when I was involved in this that for vast segments of our activities, we had become a nation not of laws, but of men. It took 6 men to create order and then run the enhanced interrogation program. And we now see what's happening to American society and American political culture at large. We have a crisis even larger than one of enhanced interrogation. And I frankly think that the trends go to the origins of this program. It's catastrophic what's happened.
Right. A very important point. I also want to introduce another guest who has just joined us, Sara Belal, who is the founder and executive director of Justice Project Pakistan, a legal action nonprofit organization that provides pro bono representation to the most vulnerable Pakistani prisoners facing the harshest punishments at home and abroad. She joins us from the Islamabad studios. Thank you so much, Ms. Sara Belal, for joining us. Now, as we've been talking about the torture tactics employed within Guantanamo and how they have been throughout history, it does raise the question about how they're also employed all across the world in different parts. Either we're talking about conflict zones or even under democracies like what we're seeing happening in Kashmir at this point in time. Is there a problem with the international legal architecture? Does it need to be updated? Does something need to change there?
Well, I mean, I think international law is this evolving concept of an agreed set of values between states. But, you know, when we look at the treatment of these people, and a lot of them were Pakistanis that were, you know, captured and then rendered, well, sold into bounties by our own government, you know, and then rendered to Guantanamo Bay and Bagram, what we see is an absolute failure of international law to protect the rights of these detainees. And in fact, you see one of the world's superpowers actually thumbing its nose at all the protections that were granted under international law. But what did work in terms of granting rights and some reliefs to these prisoners were domestic laws. So you saw that in Guantanamo, in the case of Guantanamo, you had the U.S. Supreme Court in Rasool versus Bush grant them limited rights of having lawyers represent them, but they denied those rights. The U.S. Supreme Court did not grant those rights to Bagram detainees who were being held by U.S. authorities in Afghanistan. However, what we did see was the Pakistani Constitution, which places an obligation on our state to protect the due process rights, which are the fair trial rights of Pakistanis wherever they may be. Come to the protection of the 40 Pakistanis that were held in Bagram. And under orders from the Lahore High Court, you saw the government of Pakistan pursue the repatriation and release of these Pakistani citizens that were being held in violation of our own laws and in violation of international laws. So for me, domestic laws traditionally have usually stepped up when international law is inapplicable, or the states involved are not willing to apply them. What worries me now is that we got the 40 Pakistanis out of Bagram from U.S. custody back in 2014. But if that case came today, I'm not sure how well our domestic legal order would stand up.
Right. Mr. Ray, an important point that is raised by Ms. Belal here. The torture tactics that were invented or used during the war on terror set a precedent for other countries to follow. Do you see that as a great danger even existing today?
Yes, and I'll have two things to say on this point. The first is I read newspaper reports, I get Guantanamo alerts, and all over the world, including democratic countries, Guantanamo is used as a byword for torture and indefinite detention. Story after story from various places around the world say, this is our Guantanamo, this is our Guantanamo. It's terrible because, first of all, Guantanamo is associated with the United States, but even more important, it's associated with injustice and torture. So this has become a reference point, if you will, and a rationale or justification, if you will, as Ms. Belal said. I also want to add, with respect to Pakistan in particular, that I represent Saifullah Paracha, who's a 72-year-old businessman from Pakistan who was kidnapped by the FBI in Thailand in 2003. Ill health, in a hopeless situation. There are a couple of other Pakistanis named Rabbani, their brothers. And I appeal in the most respectful and urgent terms that the Pakistan government bring these men back. It's totally unjust that they stay there. And I would really hope that the Pakistan government would step up to the plate here.
Right. Ms. Belal, as this plea is put out, what are the things, what are the initiatives, what can be done in order for these Pakistanis who are detained there? What steps can be taken?
I mean, I absolutely second the call for the government to step up and get these Pakistanis home. We've seen when the government of Pakistan has taken up the cause of its citizens, they've, imprisoned abroad, they've had a huge amount of success. So right after Guantanamo Bay was set up, Pakistan was the first country that was essentially allowed in by the Americans to visit the facility and interrogate or, to visit their own nationals. And sure enough, in the first couple of years, our government did manage to repatriate quite a few Pakistanis out of the 72 that were held. I think about 66 of them were returned to Pakistan, but there are still about six nationals that remain there. But I'd like to point to some interesting facts. In 2006, there are these U.S. diplomatic cables that showed that Ministry of Interior officials from Pakistan, specifically from the National Crisis Management Cell, had visited Guantanamo Bay with a delegation and found that the remaining 6 Pakistanis that were being held in Guantanamo Bay were essentially there at the wrong time, at the wrong place, and that they were not posing a danger or were terrorists as such. And then most recently, in February 2018, there was a committee of experts that reported to the United Nations Human Rights Council. And in their report, they did mention that they did ask for the release of Pakistani national Omar al-Balochi and a couple of other ones. So, I absolutely second the call that our government should take it up with the government of the United States. When we did that for Bagram, we got a huge success. They have a track record of successfully getting Pakistanis out of Guantanamo Bay, and we should never really forget them.
Mr. Remes, as you hear Ms. Belal says, what are the main hindrances that you see when governments even try to cooperate at an international level? What are the main hindrances in the repatriation process that you have witnessed and that you feel like might continue into the future?
I think that with respect to governments who have citizens at Guantanamo, I can't tell how hard they're pushing the United States. I can't tell how much resistance the United States is putting up. But with respect to the Pakistanis that I've mentioned who are so-called low-value detainees, they're not accused of any direct crimes against the United States, I cannot see why other governments are not pushing hard enough for the release of these men. I think that diplomatic pressure, especially from an ally, would have an effect, and I can really only say that these governments should push harder and harder and harder, and I think that ultimately that can produce results.
Right. Mr. Glenn, I'd just like to end with your take on this. Will diplomatic pressure from other governments work at this point?
Well, it can have an effect, and it's important to do. One should pressure for one's objectives, certainly. But I lived, and I'm sure it continues, the dynamic is that a country will say, well, we have an issue with a detainee or with Guantanamo and in various ways, and so we would like the United States to adhere to its obligations internationally, on one hand. But on the other hand, they have to also weigh the fact that they have they cooperate, or the United States cooperates with their intelligence services, their military, their diplomatic services, and they then have to make a rather callous cost-benefit assessment. And generally, the benefits derived from working with the superpower outweigh, or the dangers of crossing a superpower outweigh the benefits of continuing to pressure for a single detainee.
Right. And the point we're going to have to end the show on. Thank you so much to all my guests for joining us today. Mr. David Remes from Washington, D.C., Mr. Glenn Carle from Boston, and Sarah Belal from the Islamabad studios. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.